and welcome back to the Cup to the Cheers. I'm Elizabeth, and today we are continuing the series on hand sewing and the 4 most important stitches, in my opinion, that I began over a year ago. In the first video, we covered the most basic stitch, the running stitch, and some of its variations. In this video, we are going to cover the next most important stitch, and in my opinion, probably the most valuable stitch for clothing making, which is the backstitch. And there are several different variations of the backstitch, which we are going to cover today. Okay, so now we are taking a look at the sampler that we were working with last time. And we have the running stitch up here, and we have 2 variations of the running stitch below. We have the basting stitch, which is right there, and we have the tack stitch, or sometimes called the prick stitch. And that is basically just the running stitch, but smaller and more spread apart than the regular running stitch is. The running stitch up here, again, is used for garment construction in areas where the seam that you're sewing or the line of stitching that you're sewing does not need to be holding a whole lot of weight. So you could use the running stitch for putting the hem on a pocket, or putting a hem on a very light piece of fabric. The basting stitch right here is used to hold pieces of garments together temporarily instead of pins, so that you can put something on and try a garment on and see how it fits without having to work around pins. So the basting stitches are larger than the running stitches, and they are more spaced out. They don't have to be equally spaced necessarily, but just be aware that if the basting stitches get too big or they're too far spread apart, they won't hold fabric together as well, especially if you're going to be trying something on, because that puts some tension and pressure onto the fabric and onto the seams. All right, so now I'm going to show you the next and final variation on the running stitch, and that is the stab stitch. The stab stitch is a very useful stitch to use when you are sewing something by hand on fabric that is very thick or very heavy or has a very thick, stiff binding, which prevents you from bending the fabric in the way that you need to do a normal running stitch. And so a stab stitch is basically done the way you would assume that it would be from the name. You're stabbing your needle through the fabric, and you're essentially separating the motions of doing a running stitch or back stitch. Instead of doing it in sort of one connected motion, you're going to separate it. I'm going to show you how that is. It probably doesn't make very much sense from just saying separate it. So you're going to start underneath as normal. Put your needle up through the bottom of the fabric to the top, to the right side. And then you're going to, instead of go like this and bend the fabric in order to put a stitch through like that, you're going to put it straight down where the stitch needs to be and pull it through. So you've now done the stitch in 2 separate motions. Okay, and this is a lot easier to do when the fabric is very thick. So now the difficult part is getting the stitch to come back up in the right position. So you're going to use your hand that is holding the fabric to help you do that. You have your thumb on the top, the right side of the fabric as the fabric is facing you, and your pointer finger underneath. And you can feel the position, you can feel those 2 fingers can feel each other through the fabric. And you're going to put the needle under the fabric and slide it right up next to the tip of your pointer finger. So you can't see where the needle is necessarily until it comes through the fabric, but you can feel it. And if your pointer finger and your thumb are right on top of each other, then when you place your thumb in the right position on the fabric where you want the needle to be, and you place the pointer finger underneath the fabric, right underneath that thumb, and then you feel the needle and bring the needle up, then the needle comes up where you want it to be. Okay, and then you need to move your fingers out of the way so you can put the needle back down again and pull the needle and the thread through. So you can do, oops, it's getting caught. You can do a running stitch like this, or you can do a back stitch with the stab stitch method. So I've got the needle coming up on the far end of the stitch, and then I'm going to put the needle back down, backwards in relation to the direction of sewing, and then go forward again. And back. And I'll illustrate the back stitch a little bit better next. All right, and now for the back stitch, which I consider the strongest stitch definitely for clothing making. This is the stitch that you're going to use when you need strength. You're going to use it in all of the seams of the garment, any attaching pieces of garments together. Most of the time it's going to be either the regular back stitch or it's going to be the spaced back stitch or combination back stitch, which goes a little bit faster than the back stitch. So I'll show you each of those different varieties. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the back stitch. You are using a doubled thread. So as you can see, the thread on this needle, there's 2 lengths of it, and you make the ends of the threads, the 2 ends of the thread, the same length, and you tie them together, and then you use that entire doubled length of thread as if it was one single thread to make every single stitch. That's one reason why the back stitch is stronger than the running stitch and very good for garment construction. So with a running stitch, the needle moves just up and down through the fabric in one direction. And you have one thread just going up and down, up and down, up and down. With a back stitch, the movement is different. So it goes down through the fabric and then up, and then around, and then down through fabric again, and up and around and down. So you're looping the thread and the doubled threads around and around the same spot in the fabric before you go on to the next stitch. And so it's like being held in place by extra thread. So we're going to go ahead and start by making a knot in the end of our thread. And with your sampler, you have your traced line. Okay. And you're going to put the needle up from the bottom, from the underside or the wrong side of the fabric at the end of that traced line. And you're going to start like you would normally with a running stitch. Go ahead and put your needle through from the top to the bottom, and then bend the fabric and bring the thread out again, straighten it out, and then before you make the next stitch going forward in the direction of sewing, remember your direction of sewing is from right to left if you're right-handed, and it's from left to right if you're left-handed. So before you go forward in your direction of sewing again, you're going to go back, and you're going to put your needle right back basically right where the end of the thread is on that last stitch. You're going to put it right back there, and then make the needle go forward again, and make that distance between where the needle came out here, the needle goes in there, and the needle comes out there. Like this distance is the same as this distance. And then you pull it out, or you pull it through, and that's what it looks like. So it's like a dotted line, but the stitches are much closer together. And you started the next stitch. So then you just finish that stitch, start the next one in the same motion. And sometimes the thread gets tangled. It happens to the best of us. You just straighten it out and continue on like that in your line of sewing. So traditionally, now if you read the 19th century sewing manuals, they will tell you to make your back stitches 2 or 3 threads long. That means the threads of the fabric that you're sewing in, 2 or 3 of those threads are the width of those threads are the length of your stitch. So that ends up being extremely tiny. That also assumes that you can see the individual stitch or the individual threads in your fabric. And I don't know about you, but I can't do that in all lighting conditions. So yeah, just start out by making it the size that is comfortable to you, and you can get smaller as you get more comfortable with the stitch. Now, I would not make a backstitch seam until you're absolutely sure that the seam is where it's supposed to be, because it is a royal pain to pick out back stitches. You can't just, cut the thread at one end of the seam and then pull all the thread out like you can with a running stitched seam. You have to pick out every single one of those stitches. All right, so continuing on with our back stitching, we have 4 back stitches there. There are lots of variations of back stitches, and usually, as with the running stitch, the variations are the size of the stitch and how far apart you place each stitch. And you can make decisions as to what you're going to do with the size of the stitch and the spacing of the stitch based on how much strength you think the seam that you're sewing is going to need. So this traditional back stitch, very small stitch with a doubled thread and the stitches placed very close together, almost touching. This is where you're going to get the most strength in certain parts of seams that need a lot of strength in them. So for example, the side seams of a Victorian or 18th century bodice that is going to be very tightly fitted over a corseted figure. The undersides and the backs of an arm or a sleeve, where you're attaching the sleeve to the arm side. When people reach forward, that's the part that rips. So you'll need to have the strength of these stitches there. But these stitches take a long time. You have to do them one by one. You can't do a couple of them all in a row. So my favorite stitch for clothing construction is a variation on the back stitch called a combination stitch. And that is where you do 2 or 3 running stitches and then you do a back stitch, and then you do 2 or 3 running stitches and then you would do a back stitch. So it goes like this. So I'm going to gather up the fabric in my hand, and I'm going to do 2 or 3 running stitches, and I'm going to stack them, as I like to say, 1, 2, 3 on the needle, pull the needle through, and sometimes when there's a doubled thread it gets tangled. Don't worry about that. Just kind of work with it. If I'd waxed my thread better, it might not have all tangled up like this. So we have the 2 or 3 running stitches, 1, 2, 3. And then before you start the next stitch, you're going to do a back stitch. And then remember, when you do back stitch, you're finishing one stitch and starting the next. So that starts the next 1, 2, 3 straight stitches piled on top of that back stitch. And my thread is not behaving. Hopefully you will have better luck with yours. You just kind of have to work with it. And one thing about back stitching is that you do have to worry about it puckering up and bunching up like that. You have to sort of straighten out the tension after every back stitch. So what I'm going to actually do, show you how to do that, I take the needle and I go to the straight stitch nearest to it and get a little bit of slack, lift it up a little bit, and then insert my needle into that back stitch and pull on that and transfer some of that slack and kind of go like that with the fabric until it sort of adjusts itself. And then it will lay straighter. Okay, so there is a back stitch, there are 3 running stitches. Okay, so we do our next back stitch, or turning that sort of last running stitch kind of into a back stitch. And then again, 1, 2, 3. And straighten it out. And yeah, I need to be a little more careful about not puckering the stitching, but you can see how it goes. Just kind of loosen it up and smooth it out. And then that's what the combination stitch looks like on the right side. On the wrong side, it looks like this. So the back stitch, you can see where the looping happens on the wrong side of the fabric rather than on the right side. But because it's on the wrong side of the fabric or the inside of the seam, nobody is going to see when it's worn. So the strength is more important than the look for that, unless you do your stitches very, very small and you match the thread perfectly to your fabric. Now, moving on, the next variation, and the final variation that I'm going to show you that is also extremely useful, is called the spaced backstitch. And the spaced backstitch is what you would think it would be. You're basically doing a regular backstitch, but you're not placing them together so that they almost touch. You're spacing them out. So you get almost the same amount of strength as a closely spaced line of back stitching there, but you cover more space quickly. So it goes faster than the closely spaced back stitch because you can spread them out. So instead of making this needle come up, right about here, I'm gonna spread it out. Okay, so there's that one back stitch there. And then now I'm going to do another small back stitch again, but I'm going to make the space between this point and this point be 2 or 3 times longer going from this point to this point. And it just continues on along your line. And remember, with the back stitch, you have to sort of pull the fabric and straighten it out after every single one because it tends to bunch up with this stitch. But this is another really good stitch to use if you're putting some kind of trim on something that is heavy, like a heavy braid, and like a basting stitch or a tacking stitch, you might not feel very comfortable or confident in the strength of it. You can use a spaced backstitch. You can use a spaced backstitch for a hem on something. You can use a spaced backstitch because it is small on the right side of the fabric and large on the wrong side of the fabric. You can use it as like top stitching for a pocket. That means, so it will end up reinforcing the strength of the pocket as well as holding the edges down nice and firmly and smoothly. But you just continue on spacing the back stitch out. All right, so that was the back stitch and a couple different variations of the back stitch. Extremely useful when you are making any kind of garment because they're very strong stitches. So I hope that was clear enough for you to be able to try to do them on your own. And please let me know in the comments below if you have any questions, if you need me to go over anything else. In the next video in this series, we will be doing the next stitch, which I consider to be very useful as well, and that is the whip stitch. So we'll review the back stitch and its variations, and then we'll move on to the whip stitch and various variations of the whip stitch as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give me a like and subscribe to the channel so you can see the next video in the series. And I will also be coming out with more videos, hopefully in the coming months. The recreation of the Italian folk costume, as well as an in-depth look at the original antique Italian folk costume, and some more videos having to do with California history, domestic history, costume history, food history. And if you like those topics, I hope you'll come back and see them. So take care, and everybody stay healthy and happy.